The blood on her borrowed shirt had long since dried to a rust-brown stain, and Florence Thorne knew she looked more like a scarecrow than a woman when she stumbled into Monticello, Utah, that scorching August afternoon in 1878. She had walked for 3 days through the high desert country, surviving on creek water and wild berries, wearing clothes stolen from a prospector's camp, because her own had been torn to shreds during her escape from the wagon train massacre that had killed her family and left her running for her life through territory she did not know. The settlement was small, just a handful of buildings clustered near a creek that wound through red rock country, and the few people who saw her arrive stepped back with expressions that told Florence exactly what she looked like. A wild thing, something to be feared or pitied. She had no money, no family, no prospects, and the oversized men's shirt and breeches she wore hung off her thin frame like rags on a pole. At 19 years old, she had never owned a dress that fit properly. Her mother had always made do with hand-me-downs from the church donations, altering them poorly with clumsy stitches that left Florence swimming in fabric or bursting at the seams. Now even those ill-fitting garments were ash and memory, burned with the wagons somewhere back in the wilderness. She collapsed near the general store, her legs finally giving out after carrying her so far. The wooden planks of the walkway felt solid and real beneath her cheek, and she let her eyes close, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. When she woke, she was lying on a cot in a dim room that smelled of pine and leather, and something cooking that made her stomach clench with desperate hunger. A massive figure sat in a chair near the window, backlit by golden late afternoon sun, and for a moment Florence thought she had died and this was some strange angel come to collect her soul. Then the figure shifted, and she saw he was a man, the biggest man she had ever seen. He sat with his forearms resting on his thighs, hands clasped loosely, watching her with eyes that were a startling pale green in a face tanned dark by sun and wind. His hair fell past his shoulders in waves the color of cedar, and his beard was trimmed close enough to show the strong line of his jaw. The muscles in his forearms were thick as fence posts, and even sitting still he radiated a kind of coiled strength that made Florence think of the mountain lions her father had warned about. "You are awake," he said. His voice was deep and rough but not unkind. "Good. I was starting to worry." Florence tried to sit up and found her body weak as water. "Where am I? My cabin. About 2 miles from town. The storekeeper was going to send for the law when you collapsed, thought you might be trouble. I offered to take you instead." He stood, and Florence had to tilt her head back to keep looking at his face. He had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked the window light. "Name's Tobias Hollister. I trap and hunt in the mountains mostly, keep to myself. Florence Thorne." Her voice came out as a whisper. "I need to tell someone. There was a massacre. The wagon train I was with, they attacked at dawn 3 days ago. I hid in a ravine and ran when I could. Everyone else is dead." Tobias's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. "I will ride to town and tell the marshal. You need to eat and rest. When I get back, you can tell me everything you remember." He brought her a bowl of stew before he left, rich with venison and vegetables, and Florence ate it so fast she nearly made herself sick. Then she slept again, deeply and without dreams, and when she woke the second time it was full dark and Tobias was back, adding wood to the fire in the stone hearth that dominated one wall of the single-room cabin. Over the next hour, she told him everything. The attack, the screams, the smell of smoke and blood. How she had been gathering firewood early and had seen the riders coming, had hidden instead of running back to warn the others, because her body had frozen with terror. How she had watched from her hiding place and hated herself for her cowardice. How she had taken the clothes from an abandoned mining claim because she could not stand another moment in the dress, soaked with dirt and her own fear. Tobias listened without interrupting, his big hands busy with a piece of leather he was working into a belt. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You survived," he said finally. "That is not cowardice, that is sense. You could not have stopped what happened, and you would be dead too if you had tried. The marshal is sending word to the territorial authorities. They will investigate." He looked at her then, direct and assessing. "What will you do now?" Florence had been trying not to think about that question. "I do not know. I have no money. No family left that I know of. I was traveling with my aunt and uncle and my younger cousins. We were going to California to join my aunt's brother on his ranch." She looked down at her hands, at the borrowed shirt that hung so loose she had to roll the sleeves up 5 times to free her fingers. "I suppose I should try to find work, maybe as a laundress or a cook." "Can you cook?" "Not very well," Florence admitted. "My aunt never trusted me much in the kitchen, said I had no instinct for it." "Can you sew?" Florence almost laughed, but it came out bitter. "No, my mother tried to teach me, but I never got the hang of it. All my life I have worn dresses that did not fit because no one could alter them properly, and I could not do it myself. I am not accomplished at much of anything, Mr. Hollister. I can read and write and do sums. I can milk a cow and gather eggs. That is about the extent of my skills." Tobias set down the leather and stood, moving to a trunk in the corner. He opened it and pulled out a folded length of cloth, deep blue like twilight. "I bought this in Santa Fe 2 years ago," he said. "Thought I might trade it to the Navajo for something, but never got around to it. It is good fabric, strong." He held it out to her. "You should have a dress, a proper one." Florence stared at the fabric, then at him. "I cannot pay you for it. I am not asking for payment. I am saying you should have something decent to wear instead of clothes that belong to someone else." "But I just told you I cannot sew. I would ruin it." Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of Tobias's mouth. "Then I will make it." Florence was certain she had misheard. "You will what? Make it? Sew you a dress?" He said it matter-of-factly, as if men sewed dresses for strange women every day of the week. "I have sewn plenty of things. Leather, canvas, cloth. I make my own clothes. How different can a dress be?" "Very different," Florence said. "There are patterns and measurements, and it has to fit properly, not just hold together." Tobias shrugged, his massive shoulders rising and falling. "Then I will learn. You need a dress that fits. I have fabric and time. It seems like a simple solution." It was not simple at all, and Florence knew it, but she was too tired and too overwhelmed to argue. She nodded slowly, still not quite believing this strange mountain man was serious about sewing her a dress. But the next morning, when she woke to find Tobias already up and studying a dress pattern he had borrowed from the general store's wife, Florence realized he had meant every word. The first week in Tobias Hollister's cabin passed in a strange, suspended kind of peace. Florence was weak from her ordeal, and Tobias insisted she rest and eat and regain her strength before worrying about anything else. He was gone during the days, checking his trap lines and hunting, and Florence spent the hours alone in the quiet cabin, slowly coming back to herself. She learned the rhythms of Tobias's life by observation. He woke before dawn and built up the fire. He made coffee strong enough to strip paint and cooked simple breakfasts of cornmeal mush or fried salt pork. He kept the cabin scrupulously clean, everything in its place, and he moved through the space with surprising grace for such a large man. He spoke little, but when he did speak, his words were measured and honest. In the evenings, after supper, he worked on the dress. Florence watched him the first night with pure fascination. He sat in his chair near the lamp, the blue fabric draped over his lap, a needle that looked absurdly tiny in his huge, calloused fingers. He had measured her that morning with a length of string, professional and impersonal, calling out numbers that he marked on a piece of paper. Now he was cutting the fabric according to the pattern, his movements slow and careful. "You do not have to do this," Florence said. "I could try to make something myself. I would learn. I started it. I will finish it." Tobias threaded the needle with focus, his brow furrowed. "Besides, you said you cannot, so no point in both of us struggling." "Do you know what you are doing?" "Not entirely," he admitted. "But I have done harder things. Last winter I trapped a grizzly that had been raiding camps, nearly lost an arm doing it. Sewing a dress is easier than that." Florence found herself almost smiling. "I am not sure that is a fair comparison. Maybe not." He made the first stitch, testing the tension. "But the principle is the same. Patience and attention to detail. Those will get you through most things." Over the following days, Florence watched the dress take shape. Tobias worked on it every evening, sometimes for hours, his big hands surprisingly deft as he learned the techniques. He made mistakes and undid them without complaint. He consulted the pattern constantly, muttering to himself about seams and hems and darts. Florence found herself offering suggestions even though she knew little about sewing, and sometimes he took them and sometimes he ignored them in favor of his own instincts. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one night, unable to contain the question any longer. "You do not know me. You owe me nothing. Why take me in? Why spend your time making me a dress?" Tobias did not look up from his stitching. "I found you when you needed help. That is reason enough. Most people would have left me with the marshal or the church. I am not most people." He knotted off a thread and reached for the scissors. "I have lived alone in these mountains for 7 years, Florence. I left civilization because I did not fit there. Too big, too quiet, too strange. People did not know what to make of me. Out here, none of that matters. I hunt and trap and live by my own rules, but that does not mean I have forgotten how to be decent." He finally looked at her, his pale green eyes steady. "You were in need. I had the means to help. It is that simple." "Nothing is that simple," Florence said softly. "Maybe not. But we can choose to make things simple when the world gets too complicated." He held up the bodice of the dress, examining his work. "You have had a hard run of it. You lost everything. The least I can do is make sure you have something that fits when you are ready to face the world again." Florence felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight since the morning of the massacre. Tears burned in her eyes and she turned away quickly, not wanting him to see. But Tobias, who noticed everything, set down the dress and crossed to the fire, giving her privacy while he pretended to be busy with the coffee pot. When Florence had composed herself, he brought her a cup and sat back down with his sewing as if nothing had happened. That night, lying on the cot Tobias had given her while he slept in his bedroll on the floor, Florence stared at the ceiling and wondered at the strange turn her life had taken. 2 weeks ago she had been a poor relation, tolerated but not cherished, traveling to a future she did not want. Now she was in the cabin of a mountain man who was sewing her a dress, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. By the end of the 2nd week, Florence was strong enough to help around the cabin. She took over the cooking, determined to learn even if her first attempts were nearly inedible. Tobias ate everything she made without complaint, though she saw him hide a grimace when she oversalted the beans or burned the cornbread. She practiced and improved, using the supplies from his well-stocked larder, and by the 3rd week she could make a decent stew and fry salt pork without turning it into charcoal. She also began to venture outside, exploring the area around the cabin. Tobias's home was set in a small clearing surrounded by juniper and pine, with red rock cliffs rising in the distance. A creek ran nearby, cold and clear, and deer came to drink there at dusk. It was beautiful country, harsh and wild, and Florence found herself falling in love with it despite everything. Tobias taught her things without seeming to mean to. He showed her which plants were safe to eat and which would make her sick. He pointed out animal tracks and told her stories about the creatures that made them. He let her accompany him to check his traps, explaining his techniques, and Florence learned that he was a careful hunter who took only what he needed and wasted nothing. "I respect the animals," he told her as they skinned a rabbit together. "They give their lives so I can survive. The least I can do is honor that sacrifice by using every part." Florence, who had never thought much about where meat came from beyond the butcher's shop, found this perspective shifting something in her understanding of the world. Tobias lived close to the land in a way her city upbringing had never allowed, and there was a rightness to it that appealed to her. The dress was nearly finished by the start of the 4th week. Tobias had worked on it every night, learning as he went, and Florence could see the care he had put into every seam. He had added small touches that surprised her, decorative stitching at the collar and cuffs, a row of careful tucks at the waist to help it fit properly. It was beautiful work, far better than anything she had ever owned. "Try it on," he said one evening, holding it out to her. "I need to see if the fit is right before I finish the hem." Florence took it into the corner of the cabin he had screened off for her privacy and changed out of the borrowed men's clothes. The dress slid over her head and settled onto her shoulders like it had been made for her body specifically, which of course it had. The fabric was soft and strong, the color making her eyes look darker. Florence touched the stitching at the collar, tracing the pattern Tobias had made, and felt tears prick her eyes again. She stepped out from behind the screen and Tobias looked up from the fire. His expression changed, something flickering across his face too quick for her to read. "It fits," she said unnecessarily. Tobias stood and came closer, examining his work with a critical eye. He tugged gently at the shoulders, checking the seams, then had her turn so he could see the back. "The hem needs to be taken up about an inch," he said, "and I want to reinforce this seam here." "But yes, it fits." "It is perfect," Florence said. Her voice came out husky. "Tobias, I have never had anything so fine, never in my life." He looked uncomfortable with her gratitude, his big hands hanging awkward at his sides. "It is just a dress." "No," Florence said firmly. "It is not just a dress. It is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." She reached out and took one of his hands in both of hers, holding it despite how small her hands looked against his. "Thank you, truly." Tobias looked down at their joined hands, and Florence saw his throat work as he swallowed. "You are welcome," he said quietly. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Florence did not have a name for. She became suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth radiating from Tobias's body, of the way his eyes had gone soft as he looked at her. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs, and she felt her breath catch. Then Tobias stepped back, gently pulling his hand free. "I will finish it tomorrow," he said. "You should change back before you get it dirty." Florence nodded, not trusting her voice, and retreated behind the screen. As she carefully removed the dress, her hands were shaking. Something had shifted between them, subtle but unmistakable, and Florence knew with absolute certainty that her life was about to change again. The marshal came 3 days later with news that made Florence's stomach turn. They had found the wagon train, or what was left of it. 17 dead, including her aunt, uncle, and 3 young cousins. The attackers had been a renegade group, not affiliated with any of the local tribes, just violent men taking advantage of the lawlessness of the territory. They were being pursued, but the trail was cold. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Thorne," the marshal said. He was a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes. "We will keep looking for the men responsible. In the meantime, you will need to make arrangements. You have family you can contact, people who can help you." Florence shook her head. "No one. My parents are dead. My aunt was my mother's only sister." The marshal looked troubled. "There is a church in Monticello that might take you in, or you could travel to one of the larger towns, find work as a domestic or a seamstress." "She can stay here as long as she needs to," Tobias said. He had been standing silent by the door, but now he spoke with quiet authority. "I have room, and she is recovering still." The marshal's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Hollister, I mean no disrespect, but a young woman living alone with an unmarried man. People will talk." "Let them talk," Tobias said. "I am offering shelter, nothing improper. If Miss Thorne wants to stay, she can stay." Florence felt a rush of gratitude toward this strange, taciturn man who kept defending her when he had no reason to. "I would like to stay, if Mr. Hollister does not mind," she said. "Just until I figure out what to do next." The marshal clearly did not approve, but he nodded. "Your choice, Miss Thorne, but be aware that your reputation may suffer." After he left, Florence turned to Tobias. "You should not have done that. He is right. People will assume things." "You care what people assume," Florence thought about it. A week ago, she would have cared desperately. She had been raised to worry about reputation and propriety, to fear the judgment of others. But the massacre had burned that away, leaving something rawer and more honest behind. "No," she said slowly. "I suppose I do not." "Good." Tobias moved to the fire, adding wood. "Then stay as long as you like. I am not bothered by gossip." Florence studied his broad back, the way his muscles shifted under his shirt as he worked. "Why do you live alone out here, Tobias? You said you did not fit in civilization, but surely there must be more to it than that." He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he straightened and turned to face her. "I was a soldier," he said. "Fought in the war back east, saw things no man should see, did things I am not proud of. When it was over, I tried to go home to Pennsylvania, but I did not fit there anymore. I was too changed, too angry. I frightened people without meaning to." He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if seeing old blood there. "I came west to get away from all of it. Found these mountains and realized I could breathe again. No one here cares about who I was or what I did. I can just be." Florence's heart ached for him. "You are not frightening," she said softly. "You are the gentlest person I have ever met." Tobias's laugh was rough and without humor. "I am many things, Florence. Gentle is not one of them. I have killed men. I have done violence that would turn your stomach. Just because I am kind to you does not erase that." "I did not say you were soft," Florence corrected. "I said you were gentle. There is a difference. You could hurt me very easily if you wanted to. You are strong enough and you live alone where no one would stop you. But you do not. You have shown me nothing but consideration and respect. That is gentleness, Tobias. That is choosing to be good when you could choose otherwise." He stared at her with those startling green eyes, and Florence saw something vulnerable flash across his face before he shuddered it away. "You should not trust me so easily." "Perhaps not," Florence agreed, "but I do anyway." The finished dress hung on a peg by Florence's cot, and she wore it the next time they went into Monticello for supplies. The townspeople stared, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed disapproval. Florence held her head high and ignored them, staying close to Tobias as they moved through the general store. The storekeeper's wife, a plump woman named Mrs. Garrett, pulled Florence aside while Tobias was examining axe heads. "My dear, people are talking," she whispered urgently. You cannot continue living alone with that man. It is not decent. Mr. Hollister has been nothing but respectful, Florence said firmly. He saved my life and gave me shelter when I had nothing. I will not hear a word against him. But your reputation is my own concern, Mrs. Garrett. I appreciate your worry, but I am not a child. Mrs. Garrett's lips pursed. Where did you get that dress? It is very fine. Mr. Hollister made it for me. The woman's eyes went wide as coins. He made it. The mountain man sewed you a dress. He did, Florence said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. Every stitch. He is very skilled. Mrs. Garrett looked like she did not know whether to be scandalized or impressed. She settled for shocked silence as Florence excused herself and returned to Tobias's side. On the ride back to the cabin, Tobias was quiet. Finally, he said, I heard what Mrs. Garrett said to you about your reputation. I told her I did not care. You should care, Florence. A woman's reputation is important. Why? Florence turned to look at him. What good did caring about propriety do my aunt? She followed every rule society laid out for her, and she still died screaming in the wilderness. I am tired of worrying about what people think. I would rather live honestly. Tobias's hands tightened on the reins. What are you saying? I am saying I want to stay with you, not as a temporary guest, but truly. I could keep house, cook, help with the work. We could be partners. Partners, Tobias repeated, his voice flat. Yes, if you want me to leave, I will. I can find work in town somehow. But I am happier in your cabin than I have been anywhere in my life, and I think you might be happier with company than you admit. Tobias pulled the wagon to a stop. He sat very still, staring at the trail ahead. If you stay, people will assume we are married, or worse. Then we could get married, Florence said. The words were out before she could stop them, bold and reckless. If you wanted to. I know it is sudden, and I know you barely know me, but I care for you, Tobias. You are good and decent, and I feel safe with you. That is more than most women get. You deserve more than convenience, Florence. I am not talking about convenience. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, feeling the muscle flex beneath her fingers. I am talking about building a life with someone I respect, someone I am beginning to love. Tobias turned to look at her finally, his expression raw. You do not love me. You are grateful and lonely, and you have been through a terrible ordeal. That is not the same as love. Do not tell me what I feel, Florence said, steel in her voice now. I know my own heart, Tobias Hollister. I have had 19 years to learn it, and I am telling you that I want to stay. I want to build a life here with you. If you do not want the same, then say so and I will go. But do not dismiss my feelings because you think I do not know my own mind. They stared at each other, the mountain silence huge around them. Then Tobias said very quietly, I have wanted to kiss you for 2 weeks now. Every time I look at you, I think about it, but I did not want to take advantage. Florence's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break free of her chest. You are not taking advantage if I wanted to. Florence, kiss me, Tobias, please. He moved faster than she expected for such a big man, his hands coming up to cup her face with surprising gentleness. Then his mouth was on hers, warm and sure, and Florence felt the world tilt sideways. She had been kissed before, fumbling attempts by boys at church socials, but this was nothing like that. This was heat and hunger and a tenderness that made her want to cry. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Tobias rested his forehead against hers. I am not good at pretty words, he said. I cannot promise you an easy life, but I can promise I will work every day to make you happy. I can promise I will protect you and provide for you and honor you. If that is enough, then yes, I want you to stay. I want you to be my wife. That is more than enough, Florence whispered. That is everything. They were married 3 weeks later by a circuit preacher who came through Monticello. It was a simple ceremony with only a handful of witnesses, but Florence wore her blue dress and carried wildflowers Tobias had picked that morning. And when he slipped a ring of braided silver onto her finger, she felt more married than any church service could have made her. The townspeople were divided in their opinions. Some thought it romantic that the mountain man had taken in the orphaned girl and married her. Others whispered that it was too fast, too convenient, that Tobias must have compromised her. Florence ignored them all. She was Mrs. Tobias Hollister now, and she had never been happier. Their wedding night was gentle and awkward and sweet. Tobias was careful with her, conscious of his size and strength, and Florence felt cherished in a way she had never experienced. Afterward, lying in his arms in the bed they would now share, she traced the scars on his chest and asked him to tell her their stories. He did, haltingly at first, then with more confidence as he realized she was not going to judge him for his past. He told her about the war, about the friends he had lost, about the guilt that still woke him some nights. Florence listened and held him and told him her own stories, about her lonely childhood, about feeling like she never quite fit anywhere, about the terror of the massacre. "We are both survivors," she said as dawn light began to creep through the window. "We have both been through fire. Maybe that is why we fit together so well." Tobias kissed her forehead. Maybe so. The first months of their marriage were a revelation to Florence. She had never lived in a partnership before, had never experienced what it was like to build a life with someone who valued her opinions and respected her work. Tobias taught her to shoot and hunt, to read the weather and the land. Florence improved her cooking until even Tobias admitted her meals were better than his had ever been. She learned to preserve food for winter, to make soap and candles, to do all the work that came with living in the wilderness. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done before, but it was satisfying in a way her old life had never been. When she fell into bed at night, exhausted, it was with the knowledge that she had accomplished something real. She was building something that mattered. The physical side of their marriage deepened as they grew more comfortable with each other. Tobias was an attentive lover, learning what pleased her, and Florence discovered a passion in herself she had not known existed. Sometimes she would catch him watching her as she worked, his eyes dark with want, and she would feel heat bloom low in her belly. "You are staring," she said one afternoon as she kneaded bread. "I like looking at you," Tobias said unrepentantly. "You are my wife. I am allowed to stare." Florence laughed and threw a bit of flour at him, which sparked a playful wrestling match that ended with them making love on the floor in front of the fire, the bread dough forgotten. Winter came early to the mountains that year, and Florence experienced her first real snowstorm in November. The wind howled around the cabin and snow piled up to the windows, and for 3 days they were trapped inside. Tobias kept the fire going and told stories to pass the time, and Florence worked on sewing him a new shirt, having finally learned the skill from watching him make her dress. "You are getting good at that," Tobias observed, watching her neat stitches. "I had an excellent teacher," Florence said, "even if he learned from a borrowed pattern. I wanted you to have something that fit. That mattered to me." Florence set down her sewing and moved to sit in his lap, something that still amazed her because he was large enough to make her feel small and protected. "Why did it matter so much?" Tobias was quiet, his arms coming around her. "Because I know what it is like to never quite fit," he said finally. "To always be too much or not enough. When you told me you had never had a dress that fit properly, that no one had cared enough to make sure you did, it made me angry. You deserved better than that. You deserved to have something made just for you." Florence kissed him, tasting coffee and the honey he had drizzled on his cornbread. "You gave me more than a dress, Tobias. You gave me a home. A real home for the first time in my life." You gave me one too, he said against her mouth. I did not know how lonely I was until you came along. By spring, Florence knew she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice and her breasts were tender and she felt queasy in the mornings. When she told Tobias, he went very still. A baby, he said, as if testing the words. Yes. Are you happy? I am terrified, he admitted. I am so large, Florence. What if I hurt it? What if I am too rough? Florence took his big hand and placed it on her still flat belly. You are the gentlest person I know. You will be a wonderful father. Tobias's eyes were suspiciously bright. A baby, he said again, wonder in his voice now. Then he swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she shrieked with laughter and kissed her until they were both breathless. The pregnancy was not easy. Florence was sick for months, barely able to keep food down, and Tobias fussed over her constantly. He made her special teas and bland foods, rubbed her feet when they swelled, held her hair when she vomited. He became even more protective than usual, insisting she rest, refusing to let her do heavy work. I am pregnant, not an invalid, Florence protested when he tried to stop her from gathering eggs. You are carrying my child, Tobias said firmly. That makes you precious cargo. Let me take care of you. Florence wanted to argue, but the fierce love in his eyes stopped her. Fine, but I am still cooking dinner. As long as the smell does not make you sick. By summer, Florence's belly was round and prominent, and she felt the baby moving inside her. She would take Tobias's hand and place it where she felt the kicks, and his face would go soft with wonder. Strong, he would say. Taking after me already. Heaven help us if this child inherits your stubbornness, Florence said, but she was smiling. They prepared for the baby's arrival together. Tobias built a cradle from pine, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Florence sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her stitches much improved from her early attempts. They argued about names, laughing over the ridiculous suggestions they threw out. If it is a boy, we should name him Tobias, Florence said. Absolutely not. One of me is enough. What about Thomas? Thomas Hollister, I like that. And if it is a girl, Frances, Tobias said. After you. My name is Florence, not Frances, I know, but Frances is close and I like it. Florence rolled her eyes but secretly pleased. Frances Hollister. All right. I can live with that. The baby came in late September, born during a thunderstorm that shook the cabin. Florence labored for 18 hours, Tobias beside her the whole time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. Mrs. Garrett had come from town to help with the birth, and she proved capable and kind despite her earlier disapproval of their marriage. When the baby finally arrived, a squalling red-faced boy with a thick shock of dark hair, Tobias wept openly. He held his son with such care, his huge hands cradling the tiny body, and Florence fell in love with him all over again. Thomas, she said, our Thomas. He is perfect, Tobias whispered. You are perfect. Thank you, Florence, thank you for this. Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and wonderful. Thomas was a hungry baby, wanting to nurse constantly, and Florence was tired all the time. But Tobias helped with everything, changing soiled cloths, walking the baby when he fussed, bringing Florence food and water. They moved through the days in a haze of sleeplessness and joy. I never imagined this, Tobias said one night, holding his sleeping son against his broad chest. A family, a wife and child, it seemed impossible. Nothing is impossible, Florence said. She was curled against his side, exhausted but content. We have proved that. As Thomas grew, it became clear he had inherited his father's size. He was a big baby, strong and healthy, with Tobias's green eyes and Florence's dark hair. He was also loud and demanding and full of energy, keeping both parents constantly busy. He is definitely your son, Florence said one afternoon after Thomas had knocked over a shelf trying to pull himself up at only 7 months old. "He is our son," Tobias corrected. "And he has your determination. Look at him. He is not giving up." Sure enough, Thomas was already trying again, his little face set in concentration. Florence laughed and went to help him, marveling at how much her life had changed in just over a year. The seasons turned and Thomas grew into a toddler, running everywhere on sturdy legs, getting into everything. Tobias was endlessly patient with him, teaching him about animals and plants, showing him how to track and identify signs in the wilderness. Florence watched her husband and son together and felt her heart swell with love. When Thomas was 2, Florence discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Tobias was just as protective, but Florence had learned to work around his hovering. Their daughter was born in the spring, small and delicate compared to her brother, with Florence's features and Tobias's green eyes. They named her Frances as planned, and Tobias was impossibly gentle with her, handling her like she might break. "She is tougher than she looks," Florence assured him as he carefully held the baby. "She is so small," Tobias marveled. "Thomas was never this small." "Thomas was never small, period," Florence said. "She is a normal-sized baby. You have just gotten used to giants." Life settled into a rhythm. Thomas and Frances grew, the cabin rang with children's laughter, and Florence and Tobias built their partnership stronger with each passing year. They worked together, raising their children, managing the trap lines and the hunting, maintaining their home. The townspeople eventually accepted them, seeing that their marriage was real and strong. Florence made friends with some of the other women, though she never quite fit into their social circles. She was too independent, too willing to speak her mind, too content with her wild mountain life. But she did not mind. She had everything she needed in her family. When Florence was 25, 6 years into their marriage, Tobias came home one evening with a package wrapped in brown paper. "What is this?" Florence asked, setting aside the shirt she was mending. "Open it." Inside was fabric, beautiful deep green wool, soft and expensive. Florence looked up at Tobias in surprise. "This must have cost a fortune." "I have been saving," Tobias said. "Your blue dress is getting worn. I thought you should have a new one. You are going to make me another dress, if you want me to, or you could make it yourself now. You are a better seamstress than I ever was." Florence ran her hand over the fabric, remembering the blue dress he had made her, the first thing anyone had ever made specifically for her. "We should make it together," she said, "like we do everything else." Tobias smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his face. "I would like that." They worked on the dress over the following weeks, sitting together in the evenings after the children were in bed. Tobias helped with the cutting and the difficult seams, while Florence did the detail work. It was companionable and peaceful, their hands working in tandem, creating something beautiful. When the dress was finished, Florence tried it on, and Tobias looked at her with the same expression he had worn when she tried on the blue dress all those years ago. "Perfect," he said. "It fits perfectly." Florence went to him, taking his face in her hands. "Everything fits perfectly now," she said. "You gave me that. A life that fits, a family that fits, a love that fits. Thank you, Tobias, for seeing me when I was lost, for making me a dress, for giving me everything." Tobias kissed her, deep and long, and when they broke apart he said, "You gave me everything too. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. I love you, Florence Hollister. I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you," Florence said, "my mountain man, my partner, my heart." The years continued to pass in the mountains of Utah, each season bringing its own rhythms and challenges. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, learning to trap and hunt before he was 10. Frances was quieter but no less capable, with a sharp mind and a gift for healing that had the neighbors coming to her when they were sick. Florence taught her daughter to read and write and sew, passing on the skills she had learned. When Florence was 30, Tobias surprised her by saying he wanted to expand the cabin. "We have 2 children and only 1 room," he pointed out. "They are getting older, they need their own space. Can we afford it? I've been putting aside money for years. Fur prices have been good. We can afford it." So Tobias built an addition, working through the summer and fall, and by winter they had 2 new rooms, one for Thomas and one for Frances. The cabin felt like a real house now, solid and permanent, a testament to the life they had built. Florence sometimes thought about the girl she had been when she stumbled into Monticello, desperate and alone and wearing clothes that did not fit. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone from a different life. She had been remade by the mountains and by Tobias's love, forged into someone stronger and braver and more complete. One evening, when the children were older, Thomas 15 and Frances 12, Florence and Tobias sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the red rocks gold. "Do you ever regret it?" Florence asked. "Marrying me so quickly, taking on a wife and family when you had been alone for so long." Tobias took her hand, his thumb tracing the ring he had given her 15 years ago. "Never," he said firmly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You and the children, this life we built, I regret nothing." "I was so lost when I found you," Florence said. "I had nothing, I was nothing." "You were never nothing," Tobias said. "You were strong and brave and you survived when others did not. I saw that strength in you from the first day. That is why I wanted to help. That is why I fell in love with you." Florence leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed." "We gave each other everything," Tobias corrected. "That is what love is, Florence. It is not one person saving another. It is 2 people building something together that neither could build alone." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Inside, Florence could hear Thomas and Frances arguing good-naturedly about something, their voices carrying through the open window. The sounds of home, the sounds of family. When Thomas turned 16, he announced he wanted to go to Denver to learn a trade. "I love the mountains," he said. "But I want to see what else is out there. I want to learn something beyond trapping and hunting." Florence's first instinct was to protest, to keep her son close and safe. But Tobias, wise as always, supported Thomas's decision. "He needs to find his own path," Tobias told Florence that night. "We cannot keep him here forever. He is not running away from us. He is running toward his future." "I know," Florence said, "but it is hard to let him go." "It is the hardest thing we will ever do as parents," Tobias agreed, "but it is also the most important. We raised him to be independent and strong. Now we have to trust that." So Thomas went to Denver that spring, with money his parents had saved and their blessings. He wrote letters regularly, telling them about the carpentry apprenticeship he had found, about the city and its wonders. Florence missed him desperately, but was proud of his courage. Frances showed no interest in leaving. She loved the mountains as much as her mother did, and she had become invaluable to the community with her healing skills. At 15, she was already being called to help with difficult births and serious injuries, her calm competence beyond her years. "She is like you," Tobias said, watching Frances carefully stitch up a neighbor's wound. "Stronger than she looks, capable of anything." "She is like both of us," Florence said. "She has your gentleness and my stubbornness." "A dangerous combination," Tobias said, but he was smiling. The years rolled on, bringing changes and constants in equal measure. Thomas returned from Denver at 21 with a wife, a sweet-faced girl named Mary, and they settled in Monticello, where Thomas opened a carpentry shop. Frances married a rancher's son at 19, a good man named Daniel who respected her skills and supported her healing work. Both children stayed close, visiting often, giving Florence and Tobias grandchildren to dote on. Florence and Tobias grew older together, their hair going gray, their bodies bearing the marks of hard work and hard living. But their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by decades of partnership and trust. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Tobias gave Florence a gift. It was a dress, made from fabric the color of summer sky, sewn with the same care he had shown all those years ago. "You are still making me dresses," Florence said, tears in her eyes. "I will always make you dresses," Tobias said. "For as long as I have hands to sew with, you should always have things that fit, Florence. You should always feel like you belong." "I belong with you," Florence said. "That is the only fit that matters." They held each other in the cabin that had been their home for a quarter century, surrounded by the evidence of their life together. The cradle Tobias had made, now used by grandchildren. The quilts Florence had sewn. The photographs on the walls showing their children and grandchildren. The life they had built from nothing but determination and love. As they stood there, Florence thought about that first dress, the blue one that had started everything. She still had it, carefully preserved in a trunk, the stitches showing where Tobias had learned his craft. It had been more than a dress. It had been a promise. A declaration that she mattered, that she was worth the time and effort, that someone cared enough to make something just for her. That dress had changed her life. It had given her the courage to stay, to take a chance on love, to build a future with a mountain man who had seen her value when she could not see it herself. "Thank you," she whispered against Tobias's chest. "For the dresses, for everything, for seeing me." "Thank you for letting me," Tobias said. "For trusting me, for building this life with me. You are my greatest adventure, Florence Hollister. You always will be." They kissed, sweet and familiar, and Florence felt the same flutter in her chest she had felt the first time, all those years ago. Some things never changed. Some love was eternal. The decades continued their steady march. Florence and Tobias grew old in the mountains they loved, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. They worked as long as their bodies allowed, then learned to accept help when they needed it. Thomas and his family checked on them regularly. Frances visited often, bringing her own children to learn from their grandparents. Florence taught her granddaughters to sew, passing on the skills she had learned from watching Tobias. She told them about the blue dress, about how their grandfather had taught himself to sew just to make sure she had something that fit. "That is what love looks like," she told them. "It is not grand gestures or pretty words. It is someone learning a new skill because it matters to you. It is someone seeing what you need and providing it without being asked. It is partnership and respect and choosing each other every day, even when it is hard." The granddaughters listened, wide-eyed, and Florence hoped they would remember. She hoped they would find the kind of love she had found, the kind that sustained and strengthened, the kind that made everything else possible. Tobias's body began to fail him in his 70s. The years of hard living caught up with him, his joints stiffening, his strength finally waning. It frustrated him terribly until Florence reminded him that he had earned his rest. "You have worked hard your entire life," she said. "You provided for us for 50 years. You can slow down now. You have earned it." "I do not like being weak," Tobias grumbled. "You are not weak. You are aging. There is a difference. You are still the strongest man I know, Tobias Hollister. Age cannot change that." He smiled at her, his green eyes faded but still sharp. "You always know what to say." I have had 50 years to practice." They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by family. 3 children, 12 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren filled the cabin and spilled out onto the porch. There was food and music and laughter, and Florence looked at Tobias across the crowded room and marveled at what they had created, from nothing. From a girl in borrowed clothes and a man who lived alone in the mountains. They had built an empire of love, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. That night, after everyone had left, Florence and Tobias sat together in their bed, holding hands. 50 years, Florence said. Can you believe it? Feels like both forever and no time at all, Tobias said. I remember the day you stumbled into town like it was yesterday. You looked so lost, so brave. I remember you sitting in that chair, backlit by the sun. I thought you were an angel. Tobias laughed, the sound rough but warm. An angel. Me, that is rich. You were my angel, Florence insisted. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. We saved each other, Tobias said. I was dying alone in these mountains, Florence. I just did not know it. You gave me life again. You gave me purpose and joy and love. Everything good in my life came from you. Florence felt tears slip down her cheeks. I love you, Tobias Hollister. I have loved you for 50 years, and I will love you for 50 more if we are granted them. I love you, Florence, my fierce, beautiful wife, my partner, my everything. They fell asleep holding each other, as they had done for half a century, and Florence felt at peace. Tobias died 2 years later in his sleep, on a winter morning when the snow lay thick on the ground. Florence woke to find him cold beside her, his face peaceful, and though her heart shattered, she was grateful he had gone gently. The funeral was attended by everyone they had ever known, it seemed. The cabin overflowed with people who had been touched by Tobias's kindness, his generosity, his quiet strength. Florence stood beside his grave and spoke of the man who had learned to sew so she would have a dress that fit, who had given her a home and a family and a love that sustained her through everything. He was the best man I ever knew, she said, and I was privileged to love him. After, when the crowds had dispersed and only family remained, Frances found Florence sitting alone in the cabin, holding the blue dress. "Mama," Frances said softly. "He made this for me," Florence said, "before we were married, before he knew me at all, really. He saw that I needed something and he provided it. That was who your father was, a provider, a protector, a man who saw needs and met them without hesitation. He loved you so much," Frances said, "and I loved him. I still love him, I always will." Florence carefully folded the dress and put it back in the trunk. "But he would not want me to stop living just because he is gone. He would want me to keep going, to enjoy our children and grandchildren, to find joy where I can. Will you be all right?" Florence considered the question. Would she be all right? Without Tobias, without her partner of 52 years. It seemed impossible, but she had survived impossible things before. "I will be all right," she said finally. "It will hurt. It will always hurt, but I will be all right. Your father taught me to be strong. I will honor his memory by living the way he lived, with courage and kindness and love." Florence lived for another 8 years after Tobias died. She remained in the cabin, though her children worried about her being alone. She tended her garden, visited with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and helped where she could. She told stories about Tobias, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who had not known him well. She also sewed. She made quilts and clothes and blankets, her stitches as neat and sure as they had been when Tobias first taught her. She made each of her great-granddaughters a dress for their 18th birthdays, something that fit them perfectly, made with love and care. "Your great-grandfather taught me to sew," she told them when she presented the dresses. He taught me that we should all have things that fit, that we should all feel like we belong. Remember that. Remember him. Remember that love is action, not just words. Florence Hollister died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 81, in the cabin where she had spent most of her adult life. Her children found her in the morning, lying in the bed she had shared with Tobias, wearing the blue dress he had made her all those decades ago. She was buried beside him, in the small cemetery outside Monticello, and their graves became a place where family gathered to remember, to tell stories, to honor the legacy of two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from nothing. Years later, one of Florence's great-great-granddaughters found the blue dress in a trunk in her grandmother's attic. It was faded and worn, but the stitches were still strong, each one placed with care by large, calloused hands that had learned gentleness through love. The girl held the dress carefully, reverently, as her grandmother told her the story. About the massacre and the mountain man. About the girl who had never owned a dress that fit and the man who had learned to sew just for her. About love that transcended circumstances and built empires. Never settle for things that do not fit, her grandmother said. Not clothes, not jobs, not relationships. Your great-great-grandmother taught us that. She taught us to know our worth, to demand better, to build lives that fit us perfectly. And she learned that from a man who saw her value when no one else did, who took the time to create something just for her. The girl carefully folded the dress and placed it back in the trunk. But she carried the lesson with her, as generations of women had before her. The lesson that love is patient, that love is action, that love sees needs and meets them. That love creates things that fit, that honor, that cherish, that a dress can change a life, that a mountain man with gentle hands can teach the world about strength, that two broken people can heal each other and build something that lasts beyond their years. The blue dress remained in the family for generations, a testament to a love story that began in tragedy and ended in triumph. A reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of love are the simplest ones. A man learning to sew. A dress that fits. A promise that you matter, you are seen, you are cherished. And in the mountains of Utah, where red rocks still glow in the setting sun and creeks still run cold and clear, the legacy of Florence and Tobias Hollister lived on. In the children who bore their names, in the values they had instilled, in the love they had modeled, in the reminder that we all deserve things that fit, lives that honor us, partnerships that sustain us. Their story became legend in Monticello, passed down through generations, embellished and polished until it shone like a jewel. But at its heart, it remained simple. A girl who had nothing met a man who had withdrawn from the world. He made her a dress. She gave him a reason to rejoin humanity. Together, they built a life that fit them both perfectly, and that, more than anything, was their legacy. Not the children or the grandchildren or the material things they left behind, but the knowledge that love, real love, sees you as you are and creates space for you to be fully yourself. That love does not demand you change to fit. Instead, it changes itself to accommodate you. Tobias had learned to sew because Florence needed a dress that fit. In doing so, he had shown her what love looked like in action. He had given her not just clothing but dignity, not just shelter but home, not just marriage but partnership. He had seen her value when she could not see it herself, and he had spent the rest of his life proving it to her every single day. And Florence had given him just as much. She had given him purpose and joy and family. She had drawn him out of his isolation and shown him that his past did not define his future. She had loved him fiercely and completely, seeing past his scars to the gentle soul beneath. Together, they had created something that transcended them both. A love story for the ages. A reminder that the best things in life are often born from the hardest circumstances. That tragedy can lead to triumph. That loss can lead to finding. That two broken pieces can fit together and create something whole and beautiful and strong. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the dress itself, though it remained a powerful symbol, but what the dress represented. The willingness to learn new things for the people you love. The commitment to meeting needs without being asked. The understanding that everyone deserves to feel like they fit, like they belong, like they matter. Florence Thorne had stumbled into Monticello wearing borrowed clothes that hung loose on her frame. A refugee from violence with nothing to her name. She had left this world as Florence Hollister, matriarch of a sprawling family, beloved by her community, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. And it had all started with a mountain man who saw her need and decided to meet it, one careful stitch at a time. That was the legacy. That was the lesson. That was the love story that would never die, passed down through generations, inspiring others to love with the same fierce dedication, the same gentle strength, the same unwavering commitment to creating space where people could fit exactly as they were. She had never owned a dress that fit. He had bought fabric and learned to sew just for her, and from that simple act of love everything else had flowed. A marriage, a family, a life, a legend, a reminder that we are all worthy of having things that fit, that honor us, that show us we matter. And in the mountains where they had lived and loved and built their empire of family, the wind still whispered their names. Florence and Tobias, the girl and the mountain man, the love that started with a dress and grew to encompass the world. Their story was complete. Their ending was happy. And their love, captured in every stitch of that blue dress, would live on forever.